This is the second of my question and answer videos that I'm preparing. And basically the first one talked about the Patterson-Gimlin film and about some structures that I found in the woods here in northern Utah where I live. This second video I'm going to talk specifically about tracks. Now, almost everyone that talks to me about tracks that isn't familiar with the subject basically says, hey, I've seen pictures of those tracks, those plaster casts, and they all look fake. In fact, Dr. Jeff Moldrum of Idaho State University claims he has over 200 plaster casts that have been sent to him or that he's collected over the years. And so, are the plaster casts enough of a solution? Well, I think in tracks, it's not just the fact you have a plaster cast of a track. You need to see the circumstance and the situation where the track was collected. You need to see what the animal was doing, if you can determine that, and you need to see the stride length, the separation in the tracks, how the tracks were laid out, and then compare that to a human and just see, could a human be doing what this Sasquatch Trackway is doing? Now, what I have here in my investigations in this camera, I've probably seen several hundred tracks over the years. Not too many that were pristine, perfect toes, perfect in every way. Hundreds of them that were basically large impressions in the ground. You could make out as something stood there, but could you say it was a Sasquatch track for sure? Not too many. But some, in my opinion, definitely, they could not have been human. Way too big to be anything else that we know of that lives in the woods that I live near in northern Utah. So this trackway that we see online was a trackway that appeared in the canyon right after a late season snowfall. The snow had all melted, the snowfall came in, and I went up the first day after the snowfall. And remember, because the snow had melted, the ground underneath the snow was muddy and wet still. And we got about 6 inches of snow. So I go up to the top of the canyon as far as I could drive, and I walk around the barrier and walked up the road, having no idea what I'd see, but I wanted to get out early in the year and just see what I can find. And lo and behold, I come to this, actually several trackways crossing the road, and some going up and some going down the road in the snow. Now, there were some human tracks nearby, but there were some tracks that definitely weren't human. And this first one is a prime example of that. What you see here is a trackway going up a reasonably steep hill. It starts off not too steep, but it gradually gets steeper and steeper. Now, I show this trackway is over on the right side, and you can see my trackway is to the left of that. And the things you notice immediately, number one, is the Sasquatch Trackway, first of all, are much, much further spread apart than my feet are. Now, you have to realize a little bit of something about me. I'm a good-sized guy, 6'3". I probably weighed about 280 pounds at this time, and I have a size 14 boot. So my shoes are about 15 to maybe a little over 15 inches long. You can see them next to these other tracks that are going straight up the hill. These tracks are a little bit bigger than mine, maybe 16 to 17 inches, much wider than mine, okay, and wider all the way along. Now, if this was a human, it would have to be a person much bigger than I am. Well, yeah, there's some of those, but there aren't a lot of those, okay, out there. When I get on an airplane, I'm one or two tallest guys, you know, the 100, 150 people that are boarding the plane. So I'm a good-sized guy, not a giant, but a good-sized guy. Second of all is the widespread track length. Simply because this was steep and it was slippery, I could not have walked the way these tracks were. I could not have taken such large strides. I would have had to run up this hill. If I'd have run up this hill, I'd have been eating snow and mud because it was way too slippery to do that. So you see this trackway going with these long, wide strides, and it continued to plow uphill. I finally got to a point where I couldn't go any further because it was too slick under the snow. I had to come back down, and you can see on the far left, I had to basically sidestep down because I couldn't even walk straight down. It was way too slick for that. But this trackway just continued on up the hill, and the hill got steeper and steeper, and it just continued plowing on from that point forward. So that was very intriguing to me. In my opinion, this could not be human. My only explanation is Sasquatch. Your explanation is going to have to be whatever you think it might be. It certainly wasn't a bear, okay? And so anyway, after this trackway, I went a little further up the road and I found another trackway. Again, with very widely spaced steps in a very straight line, not cantered out, similar to where human steps are. And this one was going downhill and not uphill. Now this was definitely a different individual, because these tracks, though about as long as my shoes, maybe a touch longer, were not as wide as what those first tracks were. And I'm showing a close-up of one here, and it looks almost like there's toes visible in that track at the end, but it's hard to say. Again, the snow was melting pretty quickly. The sun was so bright I couldn't even see the tracks in my viewfinder. I had to just kind of guess that I had the exposure on right so that they would show up. It was so bright on the camera. But there you see my tracks compared to the Sasquatch tracks. And you'll see for every 2 steps of his, I've got 3 steps of mine in about the same length. So much wider stride. And again, had I tried to space my steps, which would have required me to run or to trot down this hill, I definitely would have just eaten it right on my face. Way too slippery. In fact, it was almost all I could do to not have a walking stick while I was walking down this hillside. So these were a couple, and then there were actually several other trackways, some even much bigger, and a couple smaller than these scattered about in the same general area. They kind of be like they're milling around almost. Some going one place, some going another, some crisscrossing the road, and I don't really know what all was going on, but there were a number of individuals that were on this road at this time, probably the night before that I came up and found this stuff. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is about a week later, I met up with the camp host of the largest campground in the canyon, and he took me around the barrier in his truck, and we drove up to one of the lakes where he basically spent the summer. And he has to go up there early every spring to make sure the snow in the winter hasn't caved in buildings or knocked trees on buildings. And this track, you see, this is an individual track right off the main road. I saw some marks in the snow that were indistinguishable. And then when I stepped down off the road, literally within 5 feet of the road was this track. Now this track, to me, is very clear. I can make out the side of the foot, both sides, and make out 4 toes. Now, I'm not saying this creature had 4 toes. 2 of the toes may have been very close together and appeared to be as one. But in my opinion, this was definitely a much larger than human track. And you can see again, my 15-inch foot is sitting there, and this track is about 18 inches long. So this is, considerably bigger than what I think any human would have been able to lay down in this area. Now this next track that I'm coming to was an interesting track. This was an enormous track. I found this in another canyon adjacent to these ones that I found in the snow, and this one I found later in the spring. And this was right after a rainstorm. I mean, this was enormous. I think 22 inches in length, and at the widest point about 3 times the width of my foot. Now this next image in the ground I found here in about June of a couple years ago, and what this is this is a handprint in the dirt. This was an area where I had seen lots of Sasquatch activity, and there had been numerous structures built and then knocked down, taken apart, or moved around and whatever. And then one day I went in and suddenly there were tracks. And there were numerous tracks in different areas, all around this general area. I found this handprint. I found numerous partial footprints, but not really showing toes. I have another photo in here that you can see both sides of the foot, the heel of the foot, but you can't really make out the toes. And so this area for this short period of time was just a flurry of activity. Now, this next track was in the same area on the same day, and this is the one I talked about, having you can see the heel, you can see up to the toes, but you can't really make out individual toes, and this is about a 16-inch track. Again, I've added some artwork here to make it a little easier to see what I'm talking about there. When it disappears, you can kind of see what's left. And definitely something stamped there, and definitely something bigger than my size 14 shoe. You know, I would say this is probably about 16 inches long. Now this next one was one that I found real early in the year in a completely different area in a different canyon. And this is a very, very large print. This is approximately 20 inches long. It's fairly narrow. And I went up 2 days in a row. The first day I went up, I found this area. I was fascinated with it. The next day I went up and an enormous tree had been drug across the trail that hadn't been. This was a really large 16-inch track, but really wide and heavy individual. You can see the mid-tarsal break very clearly in this track. You can see the toes, and I added some artwork to make it more visible. And this was right adjacent to a structure that was in the canyon. In fact, a structure I've got in several photos. Really fascinating structure, incredibly well built. Now, what I've got here is the footprint of a teenage girl, and it's about an 8-inch long, 8 to 9 inch long footprint. And the reason I'm including it is because I have a picture of a Sasquatch juvenile about the same length. And I want you to notice the differences. First of all, in the width of the heel. The Sasquatch print has a much wider heel, as you can see that on this. And it also has the mid-tarsal break, which humans have an arch to their foot. And Sasquatches have this mid-tarsal break. The best way to describe a mid-tarsal break is kind of look at your hand and imagine your hand as your foot. And you got those long fingers, and so if your hand was a foot, the fingers break at about half or even a little more than halfway into the entire length of your foot. But more importantly, your palm, you can push your palm down and it'll kind of wrap around things and basically will more evenly be able to handle uneven or broken sort of ground. And I'm guessing that's what the situation is with these Sasquatch. Also, the mid-tarsal break is much more characteristic of an ape's foot rather than a human foot, because we have an arch that gives us a very stiff foot, which is very effective for long distance traveling or for running, but not as effective as what some of these are for traveling over rough ground, maybe sometimes over shorter distances. You know what I mean? Though with the idea is that Sasquatches do travel long distances or range over large distances. And what I've done here is I put a little artwork on the Sasquatch footprint, go back to the Sasquatch print, and then I compare it again to the girl's footprint. So you can hopefully get a vision of what that is. And hopefully that's a little helpful. Now this Sasquatch footprint was taken by Utah Sasquatch. I have not found that he copyrighted this footprint. If he objects to this in any way, I will certainly remove this image from this video.